All right, so I do a lot of freelance work now, and I got one of my clients' permissions to actually walk through one of the problems I'm having right now. I fixed it last night, everything was working, I woke up this morning, it's not, have no clue why, been looking at it all morning. So, what better time to have this debugging talk? The first thing, no matter whether it's software or actual like physical engineering, you always want to try to measure twice and cut once. This is ancient construction wisdom from somewhere. So basically this means you want to make sure that you've really thought through the thing you're trying to implement or the thing you're trying to debug, so that you don't spin your wheels in some weird place that's completely unrelated to the root cause of the problem. So, let's start with the fun one, dependencies. How many people have run into dependency issues? Yes, I understand the pain. Has anybody worked on micro front ends? Then y'all really know the pain of dependency issues. So really what this talk is going to be is just a lot of the checklist points that I personally go through while I'm debugging just whatever issue is popping up at the moment. So we'll start with dependencies, and it always leads you to look like this, because you're like, why? What do you mean there's a conflicting version with this package that I installed but have no control over? How the heck do I even fix that? What does that mean? You just see all this red in your console, NPM is mad at you, and you don't quite know why. So first, simple check, look at your node version. Is it compatible with the packages that you're trying to use? If you try to use node 20 with the package that hasn't been updated in 3 years, it's probably not going to work. Then make sure you have the right certificates, because if you don't have the right permissions, maybe you're working with a private NPM package or something, and you're like, why can't I install this? It just gives me this error about something completely unrelated to a certificate or credentials or having permissions in your organization because somebody forgot to add you on the first day. But I digress on that. Make sure that you have the right certificates on your machine when you run into these dependency issues. And again, kind of on the same vein, make sure you have those NPM credentials. Go ahead and log in your terminal, export whatever variables that you need, and just double check that you have the right values in your export statements. Because sometimes, if you work with a large enough company or team, they tend to change NPM tokens on you without telling you that they're doing it. So, bug everybody, ask them if you have the right credentials. And then actually take some time to comb through all of your dependencies in your package JSON, because we have the dependencies, which are the packages that your project actually depends on. You have the dev dependencies, which you just need for development. And then you have peer dependencies. For all of my micro front-end people, you know how messy that can get, because you have your own dependencies, then your container app has its own packages installed, and you need to make sure those versions are in sync, or again, you end up with those really weird, hard to figure out NPM issues. Don't just npm-f install, because it will break things later, I promise you. Don't let it get to the CI phase, because that's when you'll find out what is broken, and that's not where you want to find that out. So, the next thing, how many people deal with React? Yeah, it is what it is. What else is there? We're not going to go to Angular. But state management, as you know, as the app grows, things get kind of crazy. You have your use state, you might have some context, you might have Redux or Zus stand, and you're lost. It's like, wait, why did this value update? Why didn't this one do it? Where even am I in my code? So one of the first places to look, especially if you use something like Redux or just something that it takes the state out of the component level, check the global state updates. Because maybe you have some kind of weird, I don't know, resolver thing going on, and it's just not pushing the values like you expect it to. And those use effect hooks. How many times have you not included a dependency in your use effect and you're just sitting there like, what the heck? I click the button, the data's loading, why isn't this UI updating? Check the use effect. It's probably something weird in there too. And then API request. So how many people work on the back end? Yeah, we need y'all help. Because when we're making these API requests, on the front end anyways, it's like, okay, so I got my data in, and why is this not in the format that it was in an hour ago? Why have the docs not been updated? Wait, there aren't any docs? Okay, so when you run into these state management issues, just very slowly and carefully go through all of the things. And that's where we're going to get into a little bit of a live demo, because I'm currently very confused as to why my app is not working. So let's see. It's so gross to see VS Code in light theme, but I think it looks better on the screen than dark mode. So this, let me pull up the right one. And just like with debugging, I have way too much stuff open. So I have this front end app. It has a lot of stuff going on, as you can see. There's a bunch of use query hooks to fetch my data. There's some permissions in here that I'm still not quite sure of what's happening. But the gist of it is, if I can get back here, there's no data yet. That's a huge problem. But when I check in my network tab, it says that there's no data. And now I'm like, why is this happening? So I'm going back and checking some of my states to make sure that my user has the right permissions. I'm like, are you an admin? I don't know. Did my state update right? Maybe? So let's see, where is this? Up here. So I'm not gonna start drilling into this because this is actually something that's been bothering me. But I think you kind of get the idea of where we start to kind of work our way backwards from the problem and slowly, very, very slowly, go through all of the things that could possibly be wrong. So I'm going to go back over here, maybe. And now we'll move on to my personal favorite, async await issues. How many people love this problem? Y'all actually like this problem? Okay, that's something. So this is how I feel when I have async await problems. Something's wrong somewhere in between my spirit leaving my body, because it's the same thing with the code. There's some weirdness happening between when I make that API call and when the promise is returned and when I actually resolve that promise. So these are a few of the reasons that I've run into for async await issues, and it's a few of the things that I just check for right off the bat. So sometimes you have this dependent parameter, like maybe you need a user with a certain set of roles, but their roles haven't been set yet. So it's actually completely undefined when you make your request and you get nothing back, or you get an error, or everything fails silently and you don't actually know that it's this async await. So you always want to check with a bunch of console logs that you have all of the data you need to pass in to your API request before you make it. Then next, how many of y'all have worked with microservices? If y'all know about the microservices and them trying to stay in sync with all of the data being separated across all these different databases, and you're technically not supposed to combine concerns, so you might call a microservice that calls another one, that calls another one, and somewhere in that chain it just, who knows what happened. There's a user missing from one microservice, there's an organization missing from the other one, and now everything is jumbled, confused, and you're trying to figure out, wait, is this my front-end code that's not fetching? Is it the back-end code that's not sending? Which one of the back-ends is not sending this? So when you run into an issue like halfway through your async await, just start, again, slowly, methodically going through all of the calls that you're making. And the fun part, third-party services are down. So if you've ever worked with Google, Facebook, any of those really big, crazy APIs, you know that they have a tendency to do things that they shouldn't. We don't want them to do the things that they do. But if it's down, now the rest of the app is missing data, and whatever you were trying to call is just not happening. So again, console log everything at every step. And the best one is not resolving the async awaits correctly. So this is where we start getting into the whole, well, I awaited this async call, but it returned a promise, and I tried to await that promise, and then it did something weird. Do y'all remember thenables? Just .then and resolve it that way. It's much easier to read and maintain as your app grows and those requests get way more convoluted. So you might do something like a promise.all and let everything resolve before you start to grab the data from it to shuffle around your UI or make other requests. And those weird permission issues, I swear that is what is killing me with this bug this morning. There's some weird permissions that aren't there, but of course it's going to fail silently because you don't have permission, and then you have to console log. So console log is typically the answer to everything async await, because then you know if you have your values or not. Then another favorite, your data just changes. You expected a number, you got an object. You expected a string, you didn't get that. So you end up with something like my favorite animal, the okapi. You thought it was a horse, then it might have been a giraffe, it might be a zebra. It just is this creature. And that's what our apps kind of turn into over time, just this weird mystical-like creature. So again, those third-party service updates can be a pain because you don't know they're coming, nobody announced it, and next thing you know, Google or Facebook is sending you some kind of intimidating email saying that if you don't update to the next version, they're just going to cut your stuff off. So make sure that when you're working with those third-party services, you have your own kind of internal documentation for what you expect. So when that data does change unexpectedly, you know that it's not something you or the rest of the team did. It's just more tech debt, right? And then if you have any like queues that are processing data, maybe something happened in one of the jobs or something's just not processing. I like to say it's like your queues got constipated. So you're not quite sure how to push them through. And you get stuck with data that's just in this really strange state. I don't know if y'all have ever seen it where your queues process like half of the data you need, but not the other half, and then you're left wondering why? And then you have to restart everything, and then you have to wait like a whole day because you're syncing data from all these different places. And documentation. Again, make sure you know how the queues are supposed to work. You know where the data's coming from, when the sync is happening. That is going to help with debugging so much, because one time I spent like 3 hours trying to figure out what was wrong with the queues, just to find out they don't actually run until like 2 in the morning so that the customers don't have downtime. Communication is key. So is documentation. And jumping back into microservices, maybe that data's just not getting saved in the right place. You thought the microservice was syncing to some database, and it was syncing to that other one. So now, again, you're stuck in this state where you're like, well, this data isn't where I expected it. So then you start to dig into those microservices and basically follow the chain. Microservices are one of the hardest things to debug, because you're just not quite sure which one is the source of truth. Unless you have documentation, then you might know. And kind of jumping back to queues, you might have some ghost jobs that are just running in the background, silently DDoSing your app and not letting anybody make requests. And how would you figure that out? Magic. But no, really you'd go into like your queue service. Maybe you're using something like Sidekick or one of the AWS tools, and you look through the logs and find out when the last time a job was run, or you find out who ran the job last, or you find out pretty much anything. But when you're looking at jobs and queues, really take your time to comb through those logs, because something that comes up a lot during debugging, especially when you're on a deadline, you start to rush, and then you start to jump all over the place. Then a little bit of anxiety, panic, and fear sets in. Slow down. You will find your issue a lot faster if you are calm. And again, those freaking permission issues. Sometimes your org decides they want to update the roles in the IAM group, and now your user doesn't have the permissions that you expected, and you get a completely different set of data, and everybody's looking at you like, oh, that's not happening for me locally. And then you have to start drilling down into like, why is this data coming back different from everybody? So you hop on a call, you start to pair program, and then you get into, okay, the data's coming back, so it's obviously not the API, obviously. And then you get deeper and deeper into the infrastructure, and you're like, wait a second, you have this one line difference in your entire user object. I don't have that one. Why do you? And then you end up talking to maybe SRE, DevOps, and they're like, oh yeah, we changed that. And you're like, how was I supposed to know that? Tell us next time. But that's something that you can just kind of take and again, slow down. You know your data's wrong. You know that the API returns something. So you, again, check those logs, pair program, console log, go through the database, which is something that we'll probably need to do now because my data changed unexpectedly. So you might end up just looking through your local Postgres DB or whatever you have set up. Connect to staging, wherever the data lives, and just start to kind of pick through. So in this case, I have this org admin user, which is connected to this organization by the role that the user has, which is an organization owner. That's the role that's supposed to have data, but it's showing no data. So, still trying to figure that part out. But when you are in one of these situations and you're trying to figure out where the issue is, this is when you start to do things like maybe put a console log here and beg it to work. So in this case, I'm just gonna look and see if I'm actually even hitting this endpoint, because that's something else that comes up. You might not actually be hitting the endpoint that you expect to be hitting. So I think one of these is my console. Yep. So I'll go ahead and refresh this and see, is it even hitting that endpoint? Oh, that's unfortunate. It is hitting that endpoint. So there's something else wrong, and we'll continue the journey down the rabbit hole. So, another thing that comes up a lot, type handling. How many of y'all actually like TypeScript?
I love it.
Woo! Same, because it saves us a lot of those weird data changing issues because you know what types you're expecting back. But, again, those third-party services and the back end make changes, and they don't tell the front end, and then everything breaks, and then everybody's like, oh, it's the front end's fault. And then it's like, no, it's the back end's fault. No, it's the third-party service's fault. It's nobody's fault, really. It's just one of those things where there was some kind of breakdown in documentation, communication. That's the key to pretty much all debugging. Documentation, communication. But when it comes to types in particular, this is where that strong documentation comes in. So let's say that the backend did release a new version and didn't tell anybody that they were changing the data schema completely. You know how you would find out? Everything's broken. So you start going through your network calls, like I have been doing all morning, trying to figure out, well, is something wrong? Am I not calling the right endpoint? Am I not passing it the right parameters? And then you find out that there's actually something that changed on the back end. So this is my back end app. So let's say that with this organization or whatever, we have decided that we're gonna pass back, let's say, what am I passing back in here? So we go through the database, find the particular organizations that this user belongs to, and when it gets to the front end, we find out that there's some kind of weird type mismatch going on, and that's why my data isn't loading, because I've changed something on the back end and haven't updated my GraphQL schema on the front end, and it's just silently failing. So when you run into these kind of type handling issues, just make sure that if you have a JavaScript or a TypeScript front end and back end, you keep them in sync. Because once they fall out of sync, then you're like, wait, what's the source of truth? And somebody's like, the front end's always the source of truth. It's where blah, blah, blah comes from. Wrong. The back end is the source of truth. It's where the data is. But I'll digress on that one. Then the next one, environment differences. So, of course, it works on your machine. Then you deploy it to staging, and it's not working anymore. And then for some reason, somebody deploys it to prod, and it does work. And you're just kind of like, what the heck? So every environment is a little different. One thing in particular that's interesting, if you work with AWS S3 buckets, if you add images to an S3 bucket, pay attention to the capitalization. It might not matter locally, it might not even matter in prod. But staging has some weird checks where it's like, oh no, that file has a capital C. This one is lowercase, broken. Or missing environment variables. So you did add another third-party service and nobody updated the envars to include those new credentials. There's a whole URL missing. There's so many things that haven't been updated in staging versus production versus your local versus what you check into your repo, and we're lost. So again, document everything as you go. That way you know when you're missing an envar and which environment it should be in. And not enough cloud resources. So again, staging. Cold starts are very slow. So you might be wondering, why is the app's performance like complete garbage in the staging environment, but locally it's blazing fast? It might be because staging is just like a sandbox. So nobody actually put a lot of money or time into building this environment, so it's a little janky. And then my personal favorite is having that CI/CD pipeline nobody actually understands. They're like, oh, that's DevOps. It's like, you don't have a DevOps team. This is in your code. Why do you not know how this works, at least at a high level? You don't have to get into the whole Terraform, Kubernetes stuff, but when it comes to something like, this is how I take my build and get it to prod, make sure you know how that process actually works. Because if you don't, you could end up with like staging in some very strange state. And you're like, wait, how did my app half deploy? Only some of my changes are here? Did somebody deploy the back end? Wait, we didn't coordinate that? Hold on, what is happening? So make sure that you understand your CI/CD pipeline. And the last and the best are business logic issues. Does the product team actually know how this feature is supposed to work? Or are they kind of just winging it as you come back with questions? So, if nobody knows how it's supposed to work, that is step one. You can't debug something if you don't know what it's supposed to do. You're like, it's working, and they're like, no, it's not. How are you supposed to know that? Or there's conflicting designs. One designer might make the app look one way. They have like all these fancy widgets and stuff. And then another designer is like, oh no, that's too complicated. We'll just delete this. And then product comes in and they're like, yeah, this looks good. And you're like, wait, what looks good? Which one is it? And again, documentation. Nobody actually knows how the architecture works. What happens when you do a release? What happens when you merge a PR? What happens when a data migration needs to be run on a different environment? If nobody can answer these questions, you get to, and you get to document them. And now you're deep into the debugging because you're asking all the questions nobody asked. And once you get that clarity, it's going to make it a lot easier to get to that root cause. So, going to wrap it up here. Just remember, everything breaks eventually. It's fine. That's why people like me, professional code janitors, exist. It's going to break. Just be ready for it. Don't freak out. Slow down. Stay calm. You'll figure it out. And plan for tech debt. Tech debt is where a lot of bugs come from, because you end up in a situation where somebody used style components, somebody has a CSS file somewhere, somebody else imported material UI, and bleh. And again, communication is going to solve a lot of your bug problems. Hop on a call with another developer. Rubber duck with someone. Because once you've been staring at a bug for hours, you're not going to find it because you're too focused. Go for a walk. Eat a piece of cake. Do something nice. And the last thing, console log. make sure that you put some kind of message you can find in there. I always try to nicely ask my code to work. Doesn't usually work that way, but at least I can see if I'm hitting the spots in the order I expect, and I'm getting the data back, or the UI is bringing in components like I expect it to. So I think that is it. I still haven't figured out what's wrong with my organizations and my permissions, but maybe I'll go eat a piece of cake.
All righty.